Welcome to Heart of a Shepherd. We are continuing our study in the book of Job. Our study today is taken from Job chapter 16. I've titled the devotional, God is with us in joys and sorrows. I invite you to open your Bible to Job 16. This will be a brief study since it's only one chapter today. Now, a little background. Eliphaz did not allow Job to be anything less than guilty of some great wickedness. You might remember in chapter 15 and verse 20 that Eliphaz reasoned with Job, saying, "The wicked man travaileth with pain all his days." Now, having begun with that false premise, Eliphaz wrongly concluded God was punishing Job. Now, Job's response to Eliphaz was recorded in three pleas beginning in chapter 16 and chapter 17. Now, the first was a plea for mercy rather than comfort. Job's response to Eliphaz is recorded beginning in verses 1 through 6. Now, let's consider it for a moment. Now, the introductory verses of Job 16 reflect the heart of a man weary of accusations brought by men who came under the pretense of showing compassion. Instead of comfort, Eliphaz had wounded and offended Job. He and his friends were, in Job's words, verse 2, miserable comforters. Job rebuked Eliphaz, and he said, and I quote, "Shall vain words have an end? Or what emboldeneth thee that thou answerest?" Well, in the 21st century vernacular, Job essentially was saying, stop talking. What makes you think you have anything worth saying? Now, Job's friends were unsympathetic to his plight, and their words only added to his misery. As you read Job chapter 16, reading all the way through 14, you can just see how they piled on the accusations that all the things that Job had suffered were those that the wicked suffer. And Job contemplated that if he were in Eliphaz's place, in verse 4, he would be able to heap upon him similar judgments. And yet, had they borne his sorrows, they would have empathy. You know, one of the things that you learn in life, the trials, the difficulties, the sorrows that you and I suffer, equips us to better minister to others with sorrow and sympathy and empathy for where they find themselves. And so we have Job's complaint against God, though, that begins in verse 7 through verse 22. Well, turning from his friends, I can count at least 17 complaints Job confessed to God, beginning in verse 7 through verse 22. Now, I'm not going to take the time to list all his complaints, but I remind you that they reflect the anguish of a hurting, troubled man. Job believed his trials were from the Lord, but he did not know their cause. His complaints, however, shed light on the plight and emotions afflicting believers in hard times. In other words, anyone that is listening to this video devotional, you have experienced loss, sorrows, trouble, betrayals, the death of a loved one, you can identify with Job's heart and his sorrows. Take a few moments, and as you read through Job 16, consider his grievances. In fact, in verse 7, grief had left him physically and emotionally exhausted. We would refer to that today as stress. We read in verse 8 that sorrow had wrinkled and deeply furrowed his countenance. His body was physically wasted. And yet, rather than pity, in verse 9, his friends attacked him like a lion seizes its prey. Instead of compassion, they scorned, and they looked upon him with disdain, leaving him a broken, wounded soul. Well, in verses 13 through 15, we find that Job was crushed under the weight and the sorrows of his troubles. In fact, he says that his face was swollen from weeping, and the dark circles under his eyes were like, in verse 16, the shadow of death. And still, In verse 17, Job argued his innocence, and he confessed his devotion to God, saying, "My prayer is pure." He maintained he had harmed no man in verse 18, and while his friends scorned him and added to his sorrows, Job held out hope that God would vindicate him before he died. Well, I close with a common adage: for those who feel life is hanging by a thread, tie a knot, hang on, and trust God. Thank you for being a part of Heart of a Shepherd as we continue our journey through this book. I do invite you, if you haven't subscribed to Heart of a Shepherd, you can do that and you'll find questions to ponder regarding today's study. God bless you, and bye-bye.